Guys, welcome to the latest edition of the People's Podcast, where we look at issues that aren't really discussed in the mainstream media, issues that are left off, issues that affect working class communities, people of colour. How's it going, Taj?
I'm good, thanks. Today we're going to be looking at gentrification and more specifically the campaign to save Brick Lane. And we're joined by two amazing guests.
We are indeed. So we've got Dr. Fatima Rangino, who's a Legacy in Action Research Fellow at the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre at De Montfort University. Her work looks at British Bangladeshi Muslims in particular and their changing kind of perceptions around dress and language. And we've also got Sotes Chowdhury from Campaign Communities Manager at Amnesty International, and who's a trustee of the New Economics Foundation. So just to start off, I was just wondering, so in terms of, we're going to look at gentrification today. And I know you guys have been involved with the Brick Lane, Save Brick Lane campaign. I was just wondering if you could tell us more about that, just to start off with.
Alpha, you go first.
Okay. So first of all, thank you for having us, for the both of us from Nidra Manush on your platform. So the Save Brick Lane campaign came about because so the Truman Brewery on Brick Lane is seeking permission from Tower Hamlets Council to utilize their space that they have to build like a 4-story building with offices, cafes, so they're seeking permission. They haven't got permission, but they've started a lot of construction work, which if we pay attention to the East End Preservation Society and the Spitalfields Trust on Twitter, you will find that they've been posting pictures of Truman Brewery actually demolishing historic pavements of East London, and particularly this area on just off Brick Lane. So the campaign came about because of this particular Truman Brewery of trying to build this development, and then of course the way that will impact the local working class communities, and not just the Bangladeshi community. I do want to emphasize, although yes, they make up the largest demographic in the area, but it will impact other communities who have been residing in Spitalfields for literally centuries, without exaggerating.
And is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think totally everything that Fatima's just said, but also like I think there's around the East End we're a rowdy bunch, so though they might be working class, they're not like we all have the ability to organize. And I think there's something to be said about this happening during COVID, during the pandemic. There has been various other attempts which we can go into later on of things that have people have tried to force through that have been thwarted, squashed by the local community coming together, and this is by whether it's corporates or local governments or other bodies. And I think there is something to be said about why it happening during this time as something that's quite suspect and not like unfamiliar ground. This is like in no way the first time or will be the last time this is sort of happening.
In terms of gentrification, it's often justified. The idea of communities changing, Brick Lane has historically had different waves of migration, and often justified in terms of development, because we know, for example, certain parts of East London are some of the most deprived parts of the UK. So what would you say to people who kind of justify gentrification on that ground, that it's about improving an area?
Do you want me to go first, Fatima? Okay, so without trying to invent new or maybe it's existing academic sort of terminology around this, but in a funny way, this is kind of post-gentrification. So like the gentrifiers, so there's one bit where, people like myself who, I was literally born on Hanbury Street, like I was born in Brick Lane. And you can observe it in two ways. One is there's changing, things are changing, things are getting more expensive, but also new people are coming in. That's not a bad thing. Just like you said, like this area has been sort of part of its fabric is to have immigrants and migrants coming through from the ages. And the gentrification in a funny way has facilitated lots of other communities moving in. The expense is a problem. But here's the funny bit. The funny bit is that now you're going to have shopping mall and glass and steel sort of very corporate buildings. No one really comes for that. The gentrifiers don't come for that. That's exactly the opposite of what they're interested in. They're interested in shabby chic and like what was old and can be turned into sort of new, but containing the sort of the same sort of exterior. You know, though, yeah, along with that comes prices and some people being unfortunately pushed out. So I don't, you know, like this is a very different space. This is, I think, you know, if the pandemic wasn't here, and just like what Fatima said, I reckon you will get so many people from different backgrounds coming to this call, as we've already seen, whether they're academics or the sort of new bougie businesses that have come in, they would be just as appalled by this same effort.
And I think the thing that I want to add to that is, I think that's a good way of putting it, is post-gentrification. And also the whole thing of like wanting to build a shopping mall bang in the middle of Brick Lane when you have Westfields literally down the road for a lot of people who live in Spitalfields. And those of us who've been to Westfields in Stratford, it's massive, you know, it's huge. What else are you trying to bring? And so you know, as Sotis pointed out, I mean, we've seen the drastic gentrification of areas like Hoxton and Shoreditch within Tower Hamlets, right? And how that's transformed. Because if you look at literature, academic or otherwise, or even media reporting, you will find that in the early sort of 90s, up until sort of late 90s as well, a lot of that area was discussed in reference to sort of the gang issues that were going on in the area of postcode gangs and this estate versus that estate, a lot of, young Bengali boys who were in gangs, and so people were scared to go near Hoxton and Shoreditch. But and of course because of COVID, I guess people aren't going there. But generally on a Friday, Saturday night, when you're walking around that area, you find all these very chic, cafes that literally charge you like £6 for like a standard cup of tea, coffee. Or these really sort of where you have communities who come in and then they are happy to orientalize themselves to capitalize and benefit off of this new arena, this market that has been opened up for them. And I think, and of course that never benefits the local community. And I think the Brick Lane best example I can give you is a cereal cafe that had opened. And I remember they were charging like £4.50 for like a bowl of cereal, from America with like milk, and you could choose what kind of milk you wanted. And again, that for me was fascinating because Tower Hamlets is one of the poorest boroughs in London. And particularly when Lutfur Rahman was mayor in Tower Hamlets, I remember, because I was a secondary school teacher in a school in Tower Hamlets at the time, all breakfasts across secondary school were free to pupils from attending schools in Tower Hamlets, because at the time, the mayor recognized that actually the poverty is so dire for the young people attending the schools here that we should make, breakfast, free for them. So to have that, while simultaneously have a cereal cafe on Brick Lane, serving literally tiny bowls of cereals from America or wherever for like £4.50, I think it's just outrageous. They've closed down, and I'm glad they have. But
they have a branch in Camden, right? And I saw this place, and I was thinking, you're paying £4.50 for a bowl of Cheerios, and most youngsters, South Asians, you go for like one-piece chicken and chips or whatever. And I'm thinking, who are you trying to cater for here? Do you think that's got anything to do with the fact that the proximity to central London, capital, and the forces of capital, does that play a role in any of this?
Just something I want to add to that is how the city is definitely encroaching into, the city of London is definitely encroaching further out towards areas like Brick Lane, Spitalfields. So that's why we've seen a shift in the last sort of 20 years of the Bangladeshi community that was mostly visible around Brick Lane. It's shifted more towards Whitechapel. So when you come out of Whitechapel's tube station, it's a lot more what you would have seen on Brick Lane maybe 20 years ago, the hustle and bustle of Bengalis, which is, there are fewer businesses now. A lot of restaurants are closing down. So if we look at Beyond Banglatown report with Runnymede Trust, you'll find that actually a lot of them have been struggling during COVID because, they rely on people coming to their restaurants, and a lot of people who don't live in the area obviously don't eat that food, right? Those who live there, it's usually the city workers who are coming and spending their crazy amounts to eat curries that all of us in this room, our mothers and fathers would never cook that kind of curry in our homes, but that's what city workers were eating, right? So I think we've got to, sort of consider the dynamic and how that's changed and who it's always for and who it excludes.
I just wanted to ask, so I read that report, and one of the interesting things, and I heard this in Luton, I raised this like a couple of years ago, that we've certainly to a small extent, or a lesser extent, it's started to happen. But there's this idea that, when I say this to friends from kind of white middle class background. I'm like, you're pushing, this gentrification people is pushing people out in this process. They say you're just over personalizing it. It's just, they see it's quite an abstract idea they view it as. Do you think that's quite, and there's almost this idea about this is inevitable, this inevitability about it, that you can't really, this is just a process. I'm not saying I believe this, but this idea that they have that it's just, this is inevitable. And there was an interesting quote that I read in there that it's something that's structural, that we can change. I wonder if you could both of you could expand on that and what people can do structurally, because some people just feel powerless against it.
Let me have a go, and then I'm sure Fatima will make much better points afterwards. So, okay. So in terms of the over-personalizing, it is personal though. That I don't think that that's a problem. I mean, it's personal when you still live there. It's not personal when you're gone. So like, if we just look at an area that has enjoyed, quotation marks, like the benefits of redeveloping, like let's say an area like Wapping or Canary Wharf, like it doesn't matter what you believe about capitalism or not, but as the sort of growth of finance happened, they took areas like the Docklands, like Wapping, which were, foul to swallow, foul to poor development, foul to health issues, and then they were able to transform them. Yeah, there's all sorts of implications about which communities that caters for and whatever, but essentially not that many people were living there. In Brick Lane, people are still there. There are multiple communities that are still there. So when somebody comes to your house and says it's time for you to move out, or what we're going to do is block your sunlight, or change every single one of your neighbors, and the thing you value is community, then it is personal. And I think that's fine to say it's personal. And like I said, like we've had a host of things happen one after another, not least like the, I don't know if you caught this, but a couple of years back, there's a big thing about they were trying to change the name from Spitalfields and Bunglatown to Spits, just Spitalfields. There was things where they degraded the status of the police station to just part-time. It makes it less safe for the people there. They wanted to build the Crossrail shaft in the middle of Brick Lane. That was a few years back. So forth, and lots of development. So I think it does feel personal, and that's fine. I think what we're seeing as well with some of these developments, it's more like it's trying to atomize you as opposed to like bring people together. Like before, developments used to think about what's the industry in the area, like when we build houses, is it for those people? And that was like a good thing that promoted community. All of this is about like a shopping center. Like no one needs to live near a shopping center, right? Yeah, but once upon a time for the textile factory or the restaurant industry, that's what people like built their community around. So I think it's okay for people to be personal. And in terms of the point previously about the city encroaching, something else is happening. So like, that thing that they say in property, location, location, location. Well, the city is growing, but on the other side, we're being sandwiched by Tech City and Canary Wharf. So that these are two of the biggest financial hubs in the UK, the city and Canary Wharf, plus the tech industry, which is the fastest growing, and they're all just across different ends or borders of Tower Hamlets, and it's just taking it up. So I think that's also important to note that there's a pattern. Fatima?
I feel like you've covered most things I was going to address, but I think the other thing I just want to add to what you've mentioned about how, if we look at the history of sort of Tower Hamlets and particularly dock areas, they were seen as, the no-go areas. This is where the poorest of the poorest live. Like these were the slums, right? That's what they're known for. If we look at stories of, people always talk about Jack the Ripper and how, he was going through the alleyways, because that's what East London, particularly that area, was known for being the slum area where you had the poor people, where you had the famous ragged school set up in Mile End, which is now a museum, because kids wore ragged clothes because they came from those kind of families that were very poor. And of course, that has continued. That trajectory of still being poor has continued, and we see that within the current Bangladeshi community in Tower Hamlets. And I think what's interesting about Tower Hamlets as well is, and this is where it's important to bring in issues around sort of climate change, because air quality is one of the poorest in Tower Hamlets. And again, looking at who does it impact and who is being benefited by these developments and who is coming in. And if we look at these developments that come in and bring their flats and offices, these flats, every time I walk past a new development, the signs will always say, you know, something like £280,000 for like a 1-bedroom flat. And we know those are just little box rooms, right? For £280,000. We all know like locals can't afford that. They can't slam down 10% of £28,000. They barely make that annually as a family. So I think, you know, the discrepancy of capital of what's coming in and who it's being catered for and who can afford those things, of just the, you know, what we may deem as a simple deposit for a house, but 10% on a 1-bedroom flat in London, if it's a £280,000 flat, that's £28,000 we're talking about. And then on top of that, the additional fees you have to pay for the surveyors, the valuation, and all the other things. So I think we've got to factor in, you know, the capital side of who has the capital to access those things that are being brought in.
I'm interested to know, I mean, you've talked about gentrification in Tower Hamlets not being a new thing in Brick Lane. So in terms of campaigning, what has actually come out of that? Have you seen much resistance from local bodies? What's the role of the council? I'm just interested to know who the key players are in all of these decisions.
Do you mind if I take this, Sultans? So Nijam Manush, we've been collaborating and talking to quite a few organizations locally. So we've been in touch with the East End Preservation Society. We've attended a few meetings with them. We've been in touch with Spitalfields Trust. Then we've got someone called Paul, who is a part of Spitalfields Life, which is different to Spitalfields Trust. So we've been talking to one another quite regularly. And we actually have an event coming up on the 22nd of March. And I'm happy to share the link with you guys when you share this podcast, where the different organizations are going to come together to discuss the next steps, because the lockdown was announced. We had actually initially, so Spitalfields Trust has secured a location on, or what road was it, Salters, where they secured that building, just off Brick Lane, not Hanbury Street. It was on...
Not Fournier.
Not Fournier Street. No, I can't remember right now. But they secured a building, a house off Brick Lane that we were going to actually use as a site for them, demonstrating and bringing people together and then galvanize people around the area. So there are multiple different people here, who are involved. And I also want to mention that local businesses have not been able to be very vocal about their support for our campaign because of the power dynamics at play, because Truman Brewery owns the land that they lease from their businesses. So one example we were able to share on social media was that of Bangla Cash and Carry, Bangla Town Cash and Carry, just off Hanbury Street. And they admitted that they were basically being, coerced into supporting the Truman Brewery's development, and it's sort of seeking permission from the council if it wanted its lease renewed. So a form of bribery, you could say. And they did come forward and they shared it sort of verbally on a recording. They didn't want to, have their face shown. There are some other businesses, but we've also got to factor in how there's an opposition that's also being built up, where businesses are being convinced that it would be good for them. But we know that that's never the case for local businesses, because what ends up happening is they end up being replaced by others. And what's really interesting, like whenever I walk down Brick Lane and I enter these new businesses, foods businesses in particular, not a lot of them serve halal meat, by the way, which is quite interesting, because you're bang in the middle of Tower Hamlets, where every other customer of yours is likely going to be a Muslim, yet you don't serve halal meat. So for me, even that, when these businesses come in, right, who can afford the rent of being around Brick Lane, but don't cater to the local community, that itself then expands the sort of gentrification and exclusion, and also known as social cleansing, because it's like, so you want to set up your fancy Korean noodle bar or whatever, but you don't want to include the very community in the local area who could actually boost your business, but you don't want to cater to them because you don't want to serve halal meat. So I think when we're talking about it, it's not just about this grand, nice glass building they want to set up. We're talking about literal exclusion of the local community, whether it's through pricing of, like, the cereal cafe was an example, or through other food shops where you're not even including halal meat, So I think it's the little things of how you are essentially dehumanizing and really excluding the local communities here.
I was going to ask, so the East End, Brick Lane and East End more generally has been kind of a site over decades, going back against, fighting against racism, fighting against labor exploitation. There's a number of racial murders there as well. But why is it that you think, like, the East End is known in British imagination for when it comes to those issues, a Battle of Cable Street, for example, but why is it that when it comes to gentrification, it hasn't really, media politically, in media and politics circles, it's not really seen as important or something that should be treated as equally as a threat to these minority communities, as was the far right, as was labour exploitation?
I'll give a funny answer to this, because kind of lots of people who are interested in it are also partly complicit. So like lots of people who are interested in this, like, let's just say you're an academic, or you're like, you know, sort of early in your 20s, you got a little bit of money and you go, oh, I want to really see life in London, whatever. People, and you know, lots of people straight away sling themselves to that area. So they're sort of partly, you know, for the clubs, the bars, the sort of bougie cafes, but also the restaurants, and sort of you know, seeing the local, whether it's graffiti or whatever. So like, it is a complicated mix of things. So you are there. So sometimes it's not always in people's self-interest to sort of go, yeah, this is really terrible. They can see it and they're kind of part of it, right? So they're like, I'm being terrible. But very few of the gentrifiers that are a lot of they probably don't see themselves as gentrifiers, but very few of those people also like hold the sort of Bangladeshi community in with like high levels of hostility. Like the people that do are the sort of landlords who kick, you know, they kick the restaurant out, the Bangladeshi restaurant out, in order for the cereal cafe to go in. It's not often the people inside the cereal cafe who are like really aggressive towards the local communities. They're there because they kind of like that edginess, right? I think the other reason the gentrification thing is not always spoken about in that, there's a flip side, which is a capitalist argument, right? You get to go, well, like, you invest in here, you do a business here, you make money, the property prices are soaring, invest in property here, rent it out, that sort of stuff. So there's this other argument that can quickly pull the rug under your argument, if that makes sense. Fatima?
Can you just reframe, can you just repeat the question for me again?
More about why it hasn't really registered as a threat to minority communities, given how labour exploitation and racism have in the East End. Why that?
I think we've also got to remember how, for example, the East End itself is framed in national media, right? And when it is framed, it's very much, it's deeply racialized. So when, for example, whenever it is spoken about, it has all these proxy terms, and it's usually in reference to the fact that it's got, you know, East London Masjid is there, Brick Lane Mosque is there. You know, Brick Lane Mosque is almost like it almost disrupts the aesthetics of Brick Lane, because it has this long minaret standing there on a Friday. You know, people are, you know, quickly rushing to get their fancy coffees and whatever, and then you have all these old Bengali uncles coming out of the masjid in their long beards. So I think this disruption that exists is something that doesn't sit well with people. You know, it doesn't physically comfort them to see that. Yes, it is edgy, and Sultan's pointed this out, it is edgy, you know, to have that kind of proximity, but also you also don't want to see that, because your edginess has to be neat and compartmentalized in a way where it's polished, and Muslims obviously disrupt that with their existence in that particular area. And I think, you know, when you have articles like, you know, the Banana Republic of Tower Hamlets, these are actual titles. There was another title I remember in The Economist once, which was called, in reference to Lutfur Rahman, it was the Badshah of Tower Hamlets. You know, so when you look at the way it's spoken about the area, it already has a particular ingrained, embedded image through popular discourse, right? Dominant discourse of what it means when we reference East London. And it is deeply racialized. You know, when people talk about the East End, people immediately think of Muslims, Bengalis, you know, people who are, you know, causing, you know, trouble. You know, it's associated now with Shamima Begum, with, you know, the 3 girls who went off. So I think we've got to remember what this particular area has become associated with, and through the war on terror narrative. So I think, you know, it's not just about interest, and of course it goes back to capitalism and sort of corporate interest, but it's also because that area has been framed in a particular way post sort of 9/11 and 7/7.
I'm interested to know what the response has been from the local Labour Council and also the Labour MPs. Because from my understanding, doesn't the council play a role in things like planning permission, for example?
the easiest way to put this is not easy, and it's a real mixed review. I think response, not just review. So we definitely have some councillors who are absolutely on board and have been fighting this fight for a long time. I think it's really important to know we've also lost a massive generation of councillors and politicians who felt this community, who were part of this community, and they are no longer here or no longer been selected and no longer elected. So I think like the politics of the matter is very much like it's something deeply felt and widely felt in communities. In terms of the views of politicians, I think is a separate thing. And I think what we've seen, like what Fatima was talking about earlier, there's bits where you need planning permission. This is where the technicalities of the planning process really drive people mad, and it's really confusing. Like, you know, beautiful cobbled streets, you can pave over them. You don't need planning permission in XYZ sort of conditions or, you know, a particular situation. But there are certain things, like Fatima said, the planning permission isn't there, and this is the sort of fight that ensues. But like, not to use war terminology too frequently, but like the war is on, but there are various battles that they have already won. So, so yeah, there's that. And I think generally speaking as well, politicians are clever enough to know that what they can't do is come against the community on this one because of how deeply felt it is. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily supporting all the time in terms of the efforts or working out what's going on. And, you know, like corporate, you know, and we see this not just in Southampton, we see this up and down the country. There are like things that are flowing your way, like in terms of jobs and stuff, important things that already exist. This is the important thing to mention, but like new jobs, which sound like it's a good thing. Like we saw that with other developments literally surround it, whether it's the Box Park, whether it's the rich mix, whether it's whatever, like, and so sometimes we only realize how good or bad they are after the fact. Fatima?
I don't know what more to add after that, but all I can say is behind the scenes, we have had a lot Labour councillors very supportive, and some have actually been very vocal on publicly. Actually, they've been very vocal, which may cost them the next election. I mean, we don't know that, but the fact that they are coming out and being very vocal about the impact this could and would have on the community, I think is definitely something that we should mention. But then of course we've got to also remember how politics works, right? Politics is a dirty business, and there is a lot of dirty stuff going on right now. I'm not sure how much of it even I am allowed to share on this podcast, but there are a lot of underhanded things going on, promises that are being made by individuals to people, you know, and of course, because a lot of it is more hearsay, and also, well, for some of those there is evidence, but again, that could turn really ugly if it entered the public terrain. But we know that there's a lot of ugliness going on the other side, and what's happening, and who is patting whose back, and who's rubbing shoulders with whom, and to convince who to do what, you know. So we know all the other things that are going on the other end. But I do want to mention that there are Labour councillors who have been very, very vocal and very supportive, and trying to figure out different ways to bring in different organisations. And one of them who has been the most vocal on his sort of social media has been Councillor Puru Mia. And Puru was the one who brought all of us together. So he brought the Eastern Preservation Society, Spitalfields Trust, Nidra Manush together, where we've had quite a few Zoom meetings with them. And I guess because the three of us, these organizations, we don't know one another. So we've had to also work with one another to build trust and where we stand, right? Because we've got to make sure our values are aligned here and our politics, because this is political, right? So when we all realize that, look, we're on the same team here, we need to like get moving. And now we've got this big meeting coming up on the 22nd, where we've literally reserved 500 tickets available for people to come and join the Zoom call and share their thoughts. And we've got housing associations as well, people from Brick Lane, different estates who are going to join as well. So I think it's important to remember this isn't just being carried out by, you know, Nidra Manush or the Eastern Preservation Society or Spitalfields Trust, but actual residents from the estates off Brick Lane and on Brick Lane are coming together with their housing association, residents association, sorry, coming on board to share their thoughts as well. So is to show that there is mobilization happening behind the scenes.
Just one last question for me, and I think Tad's got one more. And I just want to, this is like centuries of political history, social history in this area that's kind of being washed away, in essence. From your conversations with the community, there's this profound sense of loss that I kind of came across from watching the videos, reading the report. Just in your own words, I mean, from some of the things that people in the local community and the grassroots people who live this every day in, day out, what that profound sense of loss, how would you kind of sum it up, and what are people saying to you guys on the ground? Anyone can go first.
Soltis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really big question, right? And like what they're feeling of recent, I can't say because of the pandemic, but I used to work in that area, right? And people there like love the sort of communities that they're part of, the proximity to their mosque, to their shop, to their school, to their, to the history, to their neighbors, and so forth. And so imagine you were living there, you would feel like you're paying your rent or your mortgage, but somebody's trying to take your home from you while you're in there. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the, like people say, like, oh, I want to grow up, I want to do this, I want to have a family, I want to settle down. This is the exact opposite of it. It's like you're settled and someone's trying to unroot you, So I think this is a deeply, deeply personal thing. It has multiple ramifications for people's livelihoods, like their neighborhoods, and so forth. And I think what you said right at the start, Basit, of this question, which was like, for centuries people have done this. Like, yeah, East End is a bunch of dissenters, and that's a good thing. Like lots of political innovations happen, lots of, from your sort of suffragettes to your living wage campaign is from things of old to new. You can't get politicized through glass and a shopping mall. That's never happened to me. I know how I felt first time when you really unpack the image of the mural in Cable Street, but what's this going to do? Like what it will do is essentially stop the hundreds of years of politicization that takes place in that area, for good or bad. Sometimes people had to literally go out and fight the fascists, the NF and the BNP who used to hang around there. But generally speaking, that was also a good thing for people when they're shaping their politics and realizing the far right and what they do is wrong. And so they fought that off only to lose it to a building. Like that's pretty awful.
I just, I mean, from my sort of, obviously recently there haven't been many conversations because of the pandemic, but just from my own research, when I've sat with families on Brick Lane or off Brick Lane and talked about things around, changes, belonging, transnationalism, citizenship, which are areas that I have interviewed people for, when I sat in their living rooms and, I mean, people have cried to me during these interviews of sharing sort of the struggles that they went through. So I've interviewed families who, for example, were a part of the squatters movement, where Bengali families squatted derelict buildings off Brick Lane because they weren't being given adequate housing, right? So they were galvanizing families where young children were being raised in buildings that basically had damp everywhere, the water leaks everywhere. I've interviewed families who were part of the struggle of following Aqib Ali's death, just off Brick Lane. So having interviewed so many people who are a part of the anti-racism struggle, the squatters movement, people who then had to also fight to, for example, get Bangladeshi kids into schools because schools weren't, allocating space for them. So that's why in Tower Hamlets you have quite a few primary schools which have Bengali names because a lot of Bengalis fought for those schools to be set up. So if we look at Shapla Primary School, Shapla is water lily, which is the national flower of Bangladesh. There's Bangabandhu, which is in reference to the founder of Bangladesh. There's Osmani School on Valence Road, which is named after the army general who fought for Bangladesh against West Pakistan. So I think, when we look at the history of what Bangladeshis have done in that area, of fighting for education, fighting for better housing, fighting for, you know, to not be harassed, to not be, you know, to just, you know, walk home, you know, safely without being killed, which is what happened to Aqib Ali. He finished his shift in his in the factory he was working in, walking home, and he got killed. So I think, you know, for a lot of people, there's a sort of deep sense of loss and sadness around the fact that, you know, the city isn't just encroaching, but the city is doing, in a way, through legislation, through bureaucracy, what average people were doing to them on the streets in the 70s and 80s. But corporations are able to manage that and manage their racism and their sexism and their Islamophobia in a way that is guised through legislation. So I think because it's almost like a slow social death in a sense, because no one's coming to your face and calling you a Paki, right? Which is what was happening to Bengalis in East London. But what you have now is corporations slowly doing those things without ever saying, hold on a second, but we're not being racist. We just want to build a, you know, 4-story building here with cafes and whatever, shopping mall. So I think it's the way, you know, these struggles of the everyday we witnessed in the 70s and 80s, you know, and how it's just being transformed through this very, you know, violent ways through development. It's just taken a whole different persona, I guess, and it does become a bit more difficult to like politicize and radicalize people, you know, politically radicalize people, because, you know, as Soth has said, you know, at the time people could see it. There was something tangible, right? With a building, it's almost like you've crushed the people already, right? Because you've literally built up the bricks and the mortar and everything. So you've crushed them already. So I guess that then falls on those of us who want to be involved in raising that awareness around with our communities, to like remind them of like these struggles, and that we need to revive those histories and those ways of putting people in their place and telling them they can't come after communities.
I mean, Fatima, you've lived in Luton for a number of years, and I'm just thinking in terms of the future of gentrification, I'm starting to see very expensive luxury flats being built near Parkway Station, advertised on the basis that it's about half an hour to get to St. Pancras Station. Do you think that is something that could affect places like Luton outside of London? And how do you think we can resist things like gentrification earlier on?
I mean, I was born and raised in Luton, so it's not just that I've lived here for a few years. These are literally my ends, so to say. I mean, I you know, obviously, you know, I used to take the train, you know, regularly, and it's really interesting because as soon as the train would approach Luton Airport Parkway, you know, you see what is it called, the Express newspapers logo first thing on that building. You see the airport, you see all these hotels popping up everywhere, and then all these developments. You know, there was one recent one just near Luton Station, right? Just off Midland Street, and that pub that was there is now like this bougie, really bougie London Shoreditchy kind of cafe now. I don't know if you guys have been. I forgot what it's called. It's like Cafe 50 or something, Cafe 51.
Oh yeah,
and,
yeah.
And it just and it's also vegan, that place, vegetarian, vegan, and there's a Starbucks now as well at Luton Station. And I think it's really interesting that, you know, it's the subtle appearance of these major logos, right, of these major brands, that you suddenly start noticing the gentrification. And it worries me because then, you know, this is then going to push people away from that part of Luton towards Dunstable. And then I live close to Dunstable, and what I can say is there's been a massive white flight in our area, where it's becoming more and more Asian now. Actually, when we first moved here, we were one of the few Asian families. And it's just really interesting how, for me, I of course observe like the racial shift in geographic areas and the demographics and how that changes. And then the conversation around, you know, the football stadium moving from Bury Park to, you know, some M1 location.
Yeah.
I guess to answer your question simply is to, you know, how do we resist it, is that we need to, first of all, politicize the local Luton community, because I feel like there is a lack there in Luton in being aware of what that means. Because I feel like in Luton, what has happened is, because we get scrutinized so much for stuff like EDL, Britain First, you know, marching through Bury Park, and everyone gets riled up around that. And I think what people struggle with is connecting these struggles. Like when they come for Muslims, you know, these stuff, they're connected to so many other things, and gentrification is one element of that. So I think for me, one of my priorities would be, first of all, to really politically radicalize our communities into understanding that, you know, because once it starts encroaching the city of London, because Luton Airport is called Luton London Airport, which is, you know, ridiculous because it's not even in London, you know. So I think, you know, we've got to really bring people together and build up people's consciousness of what it means to politically recognize these changes, these shifts. Yes, you can go to the drive-through, you know, near the airport and get your frappe and everything, you know. I'm guilty of that myself, but let's also recognize what that means when there are all these, you know, scaffoldings coming up near Luton Station and Luton Airport Parkway.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry. I was
going to say, just on your question about like how you can sort of prevent or spot it. So there's a few things. One sounds boring, but is incredibly powerful. It's make sure you train the councillors that get the cabinet positions around housing. Make sure, because some of them just move over across on reshuffles and they have no idea. Like my guy was a teacher and suddenly is in charge of housing because it was convenient. Yeah, and it is a complicated place. So make sure you start that work early. Housing planning committees and stuff like that, put our people on it, because what that means is you'll get first sight of things, and that is really important when you're judging if a development is good, bad, or could be ugly. The other bit is get entrepreneurial, right? So this is not me saying the inevitable is inevitable, but like if there's dying high streets and you want a bit of a flavor and a change, get the local communities to start who are quite entrepreneurial, like our, you know, South Asian communities are. Get them to start thinking about investing in some of these businesses. There's nothing wrong with veganism. Like, and if somebody can do a business and employ some local people and not charge over the top for it, then fantastic. We just need to make sure we're not pushed out in order for others to come in. But it's okay if we take part in the sort of wealth generation that takes place. And then it's no longer gentrification, it's something else, right? I don't know what the term is, but it's something else when you've got control of it, because no one else is dictating on your own street what your term should be, it can't be. So there will be the two bits. We'll get political and ahead and get entrepreneurial.
I guess that would be seen as regeneration, right? Like a form of regeneration. So yeah, no, I actually, that's a really good point of making sure you're holding your councillors accountable, because believe me, in Luton, the councillors are no different to what goes on in Tower Hamlets. So it is.
Yeah, we can have a discussion on that any day.
That'll be a 4-hour discussion on another podcast, Luton councillors. But guys, thank you so much. It's been fascinating. I've learned so much. I hope listeners and viewers will learn a lot as well. But thank you for listening to another episode of the People's Podcast, and please do follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and subscribe on our YouTube channel.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thanks.